One of the highlights of the Perth US Asia Center during 2020 and 2021 has been our Indo-Pacific Fellows, who have been bringing us insights on the region while we're still locked down under COVID and unable to travel. It's very fortunate for us to be able to have people on the ground in India, in Japan, in Malaysia, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, etc., helping us understand developments there. And today, I'm delighted to have a conversation with one of our 2021 Indo-Pacific Fellows, Ritika Passi, who, again, in addition to her being a 2021 Indo-Pacific Fellow with the Perth US Asia Center, is a visiting fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. She had served previously as a fellow at the foundation and did wonderful work with the Raisina Dialogue and a number of other efforts. She's really known for her expertise on connectivity and its implications for foreign policy. Has a master's degree from the University of Sciences Po, which is in France. And so if I had even one word of French, we might break into French, but that's not going to happen today. But we're here really to launch a report that Ritika has done as an Indo-Pacific Fellow on India's infrastructure diplomacy in a competitive Indo-Pacific. Ritika, thank you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, the center has actually done a lot of work on infrastructure, on the Belt and Road Initiative, looking at kind of the broad infrastructure deficit in the region. And in that process, there's been intense focus on China's role, of course. There's been focus on Japan's role with this Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, not the most easy to pronounce kind of acronym that you might have. And also focus on Australia's cooperation with the United States and others in the Blue Dot Network. The one country that we really haven't focused on nearly enough is India, because we understand that India has actually been a major part of infrastructure delivery in the Indo-Pacific. So can you give us a quick synopsis of India's role and what we need to understand about India's role in infrastructure in this region?
Sure. So conversations about India's infrastructure outreach are usually subsumed under its connectivity initiatives in its neighborhood. And it's from that context that we often talk about India competing with China in South Asia, for example. More recently, we talk about India's participation in the infrastructure race in the Indo-Pacific because of its strengthening partnerships with like-minded countries such as US, such as Japan, and of course under the Quad, and rising minilateralism in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad, for example, the latest summit greenlit a coordination group on infrastructure. But if we dig a little deeper, even if India is nowhere near as deep-pocketed as China is, it actually has a pretty broad-based infrastructure diplomacy that is already being carried out under various foreign policy initiatives. This broad-based outreach sets up India to become a key provider of infrastructure, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. In my analysis brief, I highlight five key ways in which India is carrying out this infrastructure diplomacy. One, the fact that its infrastructure diplomacy is tied to its development cooperation. India is known to be an emerging donor through in Western nomenclature, as its development assistance, particularly in the past decade, has seen increases. Infrastructure is a key focus of India's development assistance. And as its development cooperation extends beyond South Asia and Africa into Central Asia, Latin and Caribbean countries, the Pacific Islands, so does its visibility as an infrastructure provider. The second way through which we are witnessing India's infrastructure diplomacy is, to no one's surprise, through its neighborhood first and act east policies. India is not only ensuring infrastructure connectivity with its border states, as well as within the region, railways, roads, electricity transmission lines, a first oil pipeline, but it is also building infrastructure within its neighboring countries, such as it announced the biggest infrastructure project that it will be financing in Maldives. It's providing housing in Sri Lanka, hydroelectric power plants in Bhutan and Nepal. A third way through which India is conducting its infrastructure diplomacy is on the international stage. And this is principally through its participation in new infrastructure-based development banks, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank, as well as the role that it has taken in establishing multilateral coalitions. namely the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Fourth, it's also interesting that we're seeing India's infrastructure diplomacy emerge in security spaces and sectors, in new security spaces and sectors, namely the Indian Ocean region, the Arctic, as well as the ICT and digital spaces. And lastly, India's infrastructure diplomacy, it begins at home. For example, we're all aware of the strong India-Japan infrastructure partnership. However, more than any real presence in third countries at present, it is mostly actually visible through Japanese investments in India's infrastructure at home. Plus, of course, I mentioned the AIIB earlier. India is the second largest stakeholder, but it is the biggest borrower of AIIB loans thus far. These are sort of the five main features, so to say, of India's infrastructure diplomacy. And even as this showcases a real presence in the infrastructure marketplace, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, there is, of course, a long way to go for India to establish itself as a credible player.
Well, fantastic. That's very comprehensive, and I want to tease out a couple of the themes that you've already touched upon in the kind of broad overview. First, India, as you mentioned, has been quite effective at using its aid and tying its aid to infrastructure projects. So it's very much tied into bilateral efforts on the part of India. It does seem to have been more skeptical historically about involvement in any multilateral approaches towards development aid, and particularly development aid when it comes to infrastructure. So I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit more detail about what India is doing together with others on the multilateral stage, and in particular how it's raising its profile as an infrastructure provider globally, and well, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region.
Sure. So I think there's, to summarize or to say in short, India is expanding its presence globally through two key ways. One, it has helped refocus attention on the importance of fulfilling the huge global development agenda that requires not only investments in 20th century infrastructure needs, but also 21st century infrastructure needs. And secondly, India has provided conceptual leadership as well as played its ability to convene different sets of countries together, to bring them together, to be able to plug gaps in the infrastructure marketplace with respect particularly to sustainable and climate-proofed disaster-resilient infrastructure during a time of global climate crisis. If we look specifically at individual initiatives, I think it's worthwhile to note, for example, that the New Development Bank that India led the creation under the BRICs grouping is now expanding its partnership to other countries. Most recently, Bangladesh, Uruguay, and UAE became the first three non-BRICs countries to join the NDB. And it's clear that it's going to be increasing its visibility and profile in this in the infrastructure space. If we look at the International Solar Alliance or the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the focus very much is on the Indo-Pacific region since it covers such a broad swath of countries. We can see over the years, the ISA was announced in conjunction with France in 2015, the CDRI more recently in 2019. We can see increasing institutionalization as well as increased co-option from other countries in the region as India has been wooing its partners to join both these institutions in order to again expand traction on the agendas of these two institutions. Indeed, the International Solar Alliance, we're going to see two new initiatives being announced at COP26 happening next month. One which is the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative, which is exactly what it sounds like, as well as a World Solar Bank. So we can see an increase in activity in these global initiatives that India has brought to the global stage.
Fantastic. Now let me take advantage of your broader expertise on connectivity to ask a question which involves India, but it's not just India, and that's on competition in the infrastructure space. We know that there's this massive infrastructure deficit in the Indo-Pacific, and yet so much of the public discourse has been formed around marketing, right? And the marketing of the Belt and Road Initiative, the attempted marketing of again, Japan's partnership for quality infrastructure, the Blue Dot Network, most recently the G7's Build Back Better World kind of thing. How can countries like India or Australia, others in the region, contribute to the very real infrastructure deficit that the region has without just being seen to be engaged just in competition alone?
This is a really important question, an ongoing important question, especially as the market today becomes crowded with several more initiatives and partnerships coming onto the table. And you've hit the nail on the head by the way you've actually phrased the question, in the fact that even as competition is necessarily going to drive contribution in this space, given, of course, the way that international relations today are witnessing increasing power competition, but it cannot be the only driving motivation or the only driving force behind contributions. In order to offer a positive agenda, as I've written elsewhere, there are three developments that I think that are important to note, which reinforce the need to build a positive agenda. The first is that China's BRI itself is also changing. It is witnessing, given domestic pressures and international pushback, it is witnessing a greater focus on digital and renewable energy infrastructure, smaller projects, slower investments. Second, I think it's been well established that countries would prefer choice instead of exclusive dependencies, particularly given what we've seen with COVID. And a third, today the conversation isn't just on building more, but on building right. There is a new stress on digital access, on social assets, as well as standard setting, as well as the emergence of new tools such as green finance. Inevitably, the conversation has to move beyond just a normative differentiation vis-a-vis China's BRI into actual implementation. And there are two ways, actually, two or three ways, I think, in which countries can figure out how to build a positive agenda. And we're seeing this actually happen now more and more. First, it would be to contribute based on respective strengths, based on an individual's comparative strengths, whether it's in terms of financing, whether it's in terms of technical expertise, whether it's in terms of standard setting, or sectoral expertise. If we look at India, for example, we've talked about the ISA and CDRI. A primary reason why it has been able to platform these initiatives on the global stage is because of its experience at home. It's because of its competence in solar capacity at home and experience in disaster relief. Otherwise, it would have been a hollow gesture. Secondly, initiatives and projects should not be supply driven, but should be framed around recipient priorities. And this is a criticism that has been leveled specifically against the B3W proposal, G7's proposal, but I think it applies to every initiative that is coming on board. For example, the Blue Dot Network. We've seen very little implementation or very little advancement of this network outside of just the principle of engagement. If again, we look at India, India is not known for its known for mega projects. That has been in the past couple of decades the reserve of China's infrastructure investment. But if we look at India, its focus on high and quick impact small development projects that it has traditionally financed in its neighborhood, but is also now financing across the Indian Ocean states, the Mekong Ganga states, as well as the Pacific Islands. These importantly include social and economic infrastructure in rural and urban areas, such as farm roads, hospital clinics, schools, water supply pipelines, bridges. And these are a very attractive feature of India's infrastructure diplomacy that is carried out by under its development cooperation. Lastly, I think it's also important to note that the climate in which this engagement is happening with respect to infrastructure investment and development has to inevitably include increasing networks, increasing partnerships to build consensus around an open and transparent playing field, which prioritizes engagement on the basis of good governance and best practices. And I think this speaks to the normative consensus that today we're seeing among like-minded countries, and this is important to pay attention to throughout, even as practical implementation needs to pick up.
Well, you've done a really good job of painting the picture for the big picture, principled, contributory kind of nature of infrastructure investment and projects in the region. But now I'm going to do the exact opposite and turn you around and say, but there are clearly some infrastructure investments that are tied to, geostrategic competition, and in particular with China. A lot of the more recent investments that India has had infrastructure in its near neighbors have been in response to actions that's taken place in China. That's nothing new to hear in us here in Australia. The decision to build a fiber optic cable to the Solomon Islands obviously wasn't made just out of the blue. It was in a competitive environment. So could you talk to us about how the India-China competition then has impacted its strategy towards investment in infrastructure?
So just to clarify, I think the need of the hour is not to ignore the competition, but to promote competition that advances more effective implementation of sustainable infrastructure outcomes, competition that promotes innovation, and competition that promotes choice. With respect to India's own neighborhood, land and maritime, absolutely China is an immediate factor for why India has increased its own investments and its own engagement in infrastructure in these spaces. For example, to carry on this conversation of the role that competition plays in India's regional diplomacy in its neighborhood. The fact that India is now stressing collective response to development through building regional infrastructure. Not only does this, it is clear from a competitive point of view that the more integrated South Asia is, the lesser the opportunity, the less the security concern for India. In that, China's growing footprint will have a consequence for India's own security calculus. But secondly, regional infrastructure or common infrastructure within South Asia, it corresponds to the demand and supply of these different countries together. It responds to their own development needs. So the idea is to find, I think, the step beyond just competition. In the context of what impact India-China competition has had specifically on India's outreach, and obviously broadly, as I've already mentioned, in terms of a normative approach that differentiates itself from China's, in terms of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, people-centric engagement that follows good governance practices and is guided by sustainability, accelerated momentum on its own projects. I think I'd like to quote here, there was, I think, an Iranian ambassador to India, which said this phrase that if they drag their feet, the market will not wait. And I think there's this greater recognition within India that is absolutely true now. A third consequence that we're seeing with respect to competition with China is that India is now tapping into partnerships, especially with extra-regional actors like Japan in South Asia. And now also the partnership agreement that it signed, the connectivity partnership agreement that it signed with the EU also involves potential cooperation in South Asia between India and EU countries.
Well, fantastic. Let's kind of wrap this conversation up with a look forward. What does India need to do to kind of change the narrative? Because again, I think one of the real contributions of this analysis that you've done is it's going to introduce to a lot of people in the region the role that India is playing and the trajectory of its role. But there's obviously things that probably need to be done a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit more in collaboration with others to kind of solidify the gains that you've well described. So give us kind of a a vision of where this should go in terms of India's infrastructure diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific?
So again, mere presence in the infrastructure playing field is not going to be enough, especially as countries like Japan, the US, now the EU, increase their bilateral engagement, as well as introduce regional and even global now initiatives to the table. For India's presence and participation, for it to become a more credible player, infrastructure provider in the Indo-Pacific marketplace, it has to first and foremost sustain presence and momentum. We've seen, for example, certain lulls across, over the past decade or so with respect to financing that's going out under its development assistance to its neighboring countries. Money, political will, continued engagement with its bilateral partners, as well as minimizing gaps between promise and eventual implementation, all form part of the picture. And in my analysis brief, I mentioned specific ways in which India can improve its performance under the five levers of infrastructure diplomacy that I've laid out. Secondly, of course, it's going to have to deepen its infrastructure partnerships. Coordination is key to exchange information on current projects and planned projects to ensure mutually reinforcing and complementary efforts. Networking between various entities that are involved in the process, whether it is development agencies, whether it is the private sector, to promote synergies. That has to form part of the work that India should look forward to as it promotes itself as an infrastructure provider. And very lastly, power of example and experience will go the furthest mile. We're seeing India invest in its own infrastructure, but also the EU, but also the US, and of course China, as they modernize their economies, focus on green and clean technologies, focus on digitalizing their societies. And I think this has to be one of the key ways in which India expands its presence as an infrastructure provider in the Indo-Pacific.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you for being willing to serve this year as an Indo-Pacific Fellow for the Perth US Asia Center. Congratulations on the launch of our most recent Indo-Pacific analysis brief. Again, as advertised and is attached here, entitled India's Infrastructure Diplomacy in a Competitive Indo-Pacific. You've really hit on a lot of key points that, if you think about it in the context of India's growing role in the Quad and in so many other areas, really helps kind of fill out our understanding of this dynamic. I appreciate it, and we look forward to working with you as we go forward. Appreciate it.
It's been great. Thank you.